All right, rejoining the channel is our good friend and Moochie Award-winning military writer, Kevin Maurer. Hi, Kevin. How are you?
I'm well, man. How are you?
So it's been a few weeks since you've been on the channel. Your latest at The Atlantic is titled, "Is This the Hardest Physical Contest in the World? The Best Ranger Competition Belies the Idea that the Army is Weak or Woke." So talk to us about this article.
It's a great opportunity to cover a competition I think that people know about but don't truly understand. I didn't, and I've been covering the military for a while. So it was eye-opening for me to go down to Fort Benning and see the Rangers, see the culture. I was lucky enough to go a little bit early before the competition and actually see the regiment train for it. So it really was eye-opening for me.
So a lot of mystique surrounding the Rangers and how tough this course is, not just the best Ranger competition, but Ranger School itself. What are some of the stats around the success rate and so forth?
Ranger School is by far one of the toughest schools in the Army, and that's just to get the tab. In order to be in the Ranger Regiment, you've got to go back to the Ranger Regiment and be assessed again before they'll let you in. So, I mean, I think the advertising around the Rangers, the legend of the Rangers, is well deserved. These guys are some of the best soldiers I've ever seen. But what I most took away with is the esprit de corps. I mean, they believe in the Rangers, and they believe in the Ranger Creed. They can all recite it from memory. They all have favorite stanzas. I mean, it's one thing to say you're a Ranger, you have a Ranger tab. It's another thing to be part of the regiment and believe it to your core. Stat-wise, though, about 1,000 men, male soldiers, earn the Ranger tab each year. Women, about 367 women have attempted Ranger School since 2015, and 160 have passed it. But I had an old Ranger, Sergeant Major, tell me that he thinks the Ranger tab in Ranger School is the best insurance for combat.
So of those who try to go through it, what's the success rate?
I think it's around 50%. I know a lot of guys getting recycled too. A lot of the folks that you saw at the Best Ranger competition were soldiers who had been injured or couldn't get through the first time and had been recycled back, to go back and try again.
Is there any limit to how many times you can try to go through Ranger School?
I haven't heard people try it more than maybe a couple times, maybe 3 times tops. It is a rigorous school, and it's not for the faint of heart. I think you try it once or twice. But if you're an infantry officer and you don't have a Ranger tab, I think that's telling. I mean, to be a good infantry officer, I think you have to have a Ranger tab, or at least that's what the 82nd indoctrinated me when I was covering them.
How long does Ranger School last?
So Ranger School lasts for 61 days. It's sort of meant to push the body to its limit. It's mentally taxing, physically taxing.
So that's probably one of the limits is the time frame. And you're within a career, because you'd obviously, if you're in a command, you'd have to get orders to Ranger School. You'd have to have 2 months to spare, as it were. So that's probably as much of a limiting factor as anything else to how many times you can go through it. But let's talk about the Best Ranger competition. What are some of the events? What were some of the details? And what's some of the things you saw while you were there?
So you got to think of the Best Ranger competition as sort of Ranger School compressed into 3 days. It's an athletic event as much as it's a soldiering event, and it's a mental test as much of it as anything else. It opens, with a run, and they have to carry a 60-pound sandbag back. After that, they put a 50-pound rucksack on. And part of the test is they give you all your food at the beginning of the 3-day event, and you have to sort of manage your food, as well as I think they marched 20 to 30 miles the first day between stations where they shot a mortar, they shot a grenade launcher, they cleared a house using a CQB, they shot long rifles, they shot pistols, they shot long rifles and pistols, they shot shotguns. It was this sort of multifaceted training on all the different ranges around Fort Benning. But to get from one range to another, you had to navigate your own way there. And the idea was, they call it Ranger Reckoning. In the past, they've done it more linear, where all the teams congregate, they do an event, then they move to the next event. This was supposed to mimic more of an adventure race style. And I think it weeded a lot of teams out because the wear and tear and on the body took a toll. And then on the flip side of that, you also had to manage it because you had to be back at the staging area. I think initially it was like 5, and then they extended to 7 because the teams were strung out that far and they were having bottlenecks at certain events. By the time they get back that night to do an obstacle course before the night march, They've marched a good 20 some miles with packs. They've completed, 10 or 12 events, and they were pretty tired. And then from there, they had to do Malvesti, which is an obstacle course that all Ranger School students do. A worm pit, they call it, with barbed wire on top where they have to crawl in the water underneath. Everything with Rangers starts with pull-ups and climbing a rope. These are the things the Rangers do all the time. I swear they probably climb into their bunks on a rope. That was just the first day. And then that night they marched. They had a ruck march where they had this diabolical exercise in the middle of it where they had to march with their rucksacks for a couple of miles and then put the rucksacks down and then pick up 40-pound water cans in each hand and carry them for an undetermined amount of distance. But if they put them down, they had to run back to the start line. And once they completed that, they got to sleep a little bit before they then went to the Doughboy Stadium on that second day. And that was really like a round robin of exercises, from physical fitness stuff to throwing axes to throwing grenades, before then leaving that area into going into the swamp. And that night they did a map recon where they had to find waypoints in the swamp at night. So that's the 2 days. That's the first 2 days, and then the third day is a whole bunch more stuff.
So this is both a team event and an individual event?
It's 2-man teams. And I think the prevailing idea I got from most of the soldiers that participated was they were there for the guy with them. So while it was an individual test, I think most feared of letting down their teammates. And so it is a team event, and it breeds that esprit de corps just as much as an individual test. But you could see which teams were getting along well. You could see which teams were picking each other up. The team that made this a historic making event was Gabby White and her partner Seth. They really had a great rapport. Some of the best, I think, across the field.
So tell us a little bit about that team, their background, their pedigree.
So they're 2 officers that are in a career course at Benning who competed. Gabby White she's a Ranger qualified West Point grad, first female to compete in the Breast Ranger competition, and she finished all 3 days. An athlete of athletes, a very, very impressive athlete, and an impressive leader. Her ability to take on that kind of mantle and spotlight and do it with such grace was really impressive. She didn't want to do interviews. She declined to do all interviews. She sort of let her performance make the statement, and her performance made a statement. She was one of, I think 16 teams that got to the last day. Out of 52 teams, majority of them washed out before the last day, and she finished every event, including the last run.
So what happens on the last day?
So the last day, they do a big obstacle course, the Derby Queen. Lots of tall structures that they have to navigate. And that's early in the morning on the last day. And then from there, they went down and built poncho rafts. Essentially, they put their rucksacks in a poncho, and then they haul them onto a Blackhawk and jump into Victory Pond, where they then have to swim them to shore, and then they have to run and paddle a boat back to the boat dock, where they then perform. It's like a Ranger water assessment. It's when they're way up on the ropes with the Ranger tab, and they have to hit it, and they fall in the water and swim and come back, and that's all timed. And then from there, they had to they rested after a mental test. They have in between some of these events, they have like little mental, pop quizzes or some sort of puzzles they have to figure out to try to test their mental acuity while they're this tired. And then the last event was a run, and that's the iconic picture you see a lot, where the Rangers are crossing the finish line with the rifles waved above their head with the bibs. That was the last day. So the third day is a little compressed. It's a little, but I mean, at that point, they've burned almost 30,000 calories. They're down to the last bit of food. Their feet are on fire. They're exhausted, and it's only 16 teams left at that point. Everybody else is, washed out or been cut because they couldn't finish in time.
Well, how many did they start with?
52.
Okay. So
yeah,
52 start, 16 finish.
Yep.
Wow. Your subtitle of this article is "The Best Ranger Competition Belies the Idea That the Army is Weak or Woke." So the current administration came into office, and Secretary Hegseth has been very vocal about his war on woke and all things DEI. He's taken some deliberate steps around the optics of that, as we documented on the channel a few months ago. Fired the chairman, fired the CNO, fired the deputy Air Force Chief of Staff for their history of statements that they viewed as woke. with that as the backdrop, what did you see here that made you think that maybe this is performative?
Well, first off, I didn't even know, Lieutenant White was going to participate in this event until I got there. I think it was well into the middle of the first day where someone looked at me and said, "Is that a woman?" as she ran by. So I'm not sure of any other time, or any other. You've been in the military or covered the military a long time. The military is not shy about promoting historic events, milestones. This was never publicized whatsoever. And I'm sure she didn't want it to be publicized, but it is a very big deal that she, one, competed, and to compete at the level she competed, I think should be recognized. I mean, it's a huge accomplishment. The other thing, though, is I don't see. I feel like a lot of the culture warrior stuff that we see around the woke military is like old guys, complaining about the younger soldiers. I think it's been done probably since George Washington. I'm sure they were making fun of, the guys that fought in the French and Indian War were making fun of the new guys for the revolution. I think it's been done forever. I think to be honest with you though, I think over and over again, we've been shown that the military doesn't care when you're getting into combat or when you're in a situation where you guys are teamed up and working hard towards a mission. All of that stuff doesn't care. Your political ideology, any of it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. It also takes apart the idea that we shouldn't, as a nation, look at anyone willing to serve and allow them to serve, and that we have talent regardless of who you are, what you look like. Right? I mean, think of the strike in Iran. One of the pilots was a woman. The nation's less safe if we don't allow her and Lieutenant White and others who want to serve and have the capacity to serve and at a high level to serve. And I think in some ways the Best Ranger competition personifies, exemplifies what Hegseth and President Trump want, which is a meritocracy. Everybody was graded the same way, regardless. If you were competing in that, it didn't matter. And I think that's all anybody would ask. So I just think sometimes we get lost in the culture, performative culture war, instead of looking at what's the best way to get the best talent into the best jobs to protect the nation.
Very well said. And as you suggest, the standards of Ranger School have not been lowered. Certainly, the way that the Best Ranger competition is organized and scored has not been dumbed down because of the presence of a handful of females over the course of the competition. Like you're saying, this is a meritocracy. Now, certainly those who accused the military of being woke weren't talking about special operators, probably, right? And you've spent a lot of time downrange and in garrison with SEALs and Rangers and Delta and all the other tier one organizations. So you've seen, you know this culture maybe better than anybody who covers the beat. So if perhaps those who are waging this war to de-woke the military would respond, we were never talking about Ranger School, right? However, just beyond this meritocracy, you hear this sort of bleed over about women in combat and so forth and so on. So now, to your point, this starts to not be a meritocracy. It's not about, can you make the standard? It's, what's your gender?
Take Gabby White and her competition in the Best Ranger competition, right? She gets to the third day and completes it. Everybody who washed out before her was a man. Does that make them less of a man? No. Does that make them less of a soldier? No. But so I'm not sure the data point. I think it comes down to, can you do the job? She proved she could do that job. For those 3 days, she did the job. Could I do it? No, man. I couldn't.
So when I was a mid, I was part of the third class to have females as part of the brigade. So we were still, new at that. My female classmates were pioneers. But, we'd do the PFT or whatever, and I'd get smoked by a large percentage of them. I'd pass. But if you're like, okay, everybody behind her should not be eligible, starting with her and behind her, should not be eligible for military service or to serve as a line officer. That's kind of what you're saying when you're like, women can't serve. So I learned my lesson, early on with respect to that. And so I think you're right that, there's a standard. If you can reach the standard, you should not be unable to serve.
I also would argue that's all anybody wants. If you were willing to raise your hand and serve in the military, all you want is a chance with the same standard. If you can meet the standard, you should get that chance. I'm not sure it has to be much more complicated. And honestly, I think the more we wring our hands about this, and the more this becomes sort of a prevailing policy idea or a framework in which to do policy, the more we get away from what we're really facing, which is a modern battlefield that has transformed itself since the War on Terror.
So I think the reason they didn't want to make a big deal about Gabby's participation, certainly her motives are pure. It's the same thing I saw at the Oceana Air Show last year when I ran into the first female naval aviator to commit an air-to-air weapon and shoot down a Houthi drone. Because I was like, hey, can we talk about it, on the channel? And she's like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Part of it is the reaction that she fears would happen, the trolls. But the other is, look, I just did my job, right? So I'm sure Gabby's motivation was the latter. Now, in terms of the Army PAO machine or whatever, I'm sure it's half, let's not make a big deal out of it, and half, we're absolutely not going to frame this as first female with this Secretary of Defense.
I mean, I don't blame anybody. I don't blame Gabby for not really wanting to be in the spotlight. I don't blame the Army PAOs from not, how they handle it. They got to handle it the best way they can. I really just point that out because it's a data point in an ongoing look at the way that we're thinking about and framing the military and framing who's in the military and why they're in the military, and the fact that we're not celebrating, soldiers. I mean, because that's what we'd be celebrating a soldier who's achieved a milestone. It's unfortunate that like using your example, it's unfortunate that aviator, isn't willing to acknowledge that milestone or doesn't want to publicly acknowledge that milestone because of the trolls, because of the online, vitriol she'll experience. It just seems silly.
So the bottom line about you're witnessing the best Ranger competition is you're heartened by what you saw, and the average American should feel secure about those who are serving now and their focus and motivation.
I left there, one, feeling very old because I saw there's a Global War on Terror Memorial Conference Room, and I covered that war a lot, and it makes you feel very old when you realize that most of the soldiers you're talking to think that's history and not, it's pretty visceral for you. But at the end of the day, like, I left there pretty confident that the next generation of soldiers, a tough, purpose-driven soldier that I think can adapt to this modern battlefield. So I was impressed. And being around the Ranger Regiment, and then on top of that, around Rangers that are willing to then put themselves out in this competition, I think speaks to the health of our service and the soldiers that are part of it.
Again, the article is this the hardest physical contest in the world? By Moochie Award winning Kevin Maurer in The Atlantic. Kevin, thanks for coming by today, and I hope we see you in real life before too long.
I'd like that. I appreciate you having me again.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.